Okay, so I'm going to share this slideshow with you about immigration. And we're going to focus first on immigration from Europe. So that's going to be the first region in the world we talk about here. I'm going to try to highlight some of the big things. Here's the deal. Don't worry about writing everything down and doing that as I'm explaining it. Just write down things that help you understand things or help you remember. And if there's any specifics that I'm like, hey, write this down, I will tell you, okay? And if you ever miss anything, don't worry about asking me to go slow or anything. I will always include the slideshow or the lecture video in Schoology for you where you can go back and look and find things after we're done. So the first group is European immigrants. And there were different reasons that European immigrants were coming into the country at the time. But just to give you an overall number, between 1870 and 1920, so largely this Gilded Age period we're talking about, and then the time up until the 20s, around 20 million Americans immigrated to the United States, okay? And so a big number of people immigrated during this time period, that 50-year time period. Prior to 1890, so like the first 20 years of that, so 1870, 1890, this Gilded Age time we're studying, most of the Europeans who immigrated to the United States came from Western and Northern Europe. So we're talking about like Germany, England, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, those types of countries, okay, from the northern part and western part of Europe. However, that started to shift quite a bit once you got into the 1890s. And at that point, you started seeing a lot more immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. We're talking about places like Italy or Poland or even the Soviet Union and Greece or different places like that. So southern parts of Europe, Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at the time. So Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. Now, there were a bunch of different reasons that Europeans were coming to the United States. A lot of it was religious freedom because some religions were being persecuted in their own home countries. But the United States, as you probably are aware, we don't have an official religion. And with the First Amendment, there's the freedom of religion. And so people wanted to go to a place where they were free to practice their religion. Also, Europe started getting built up so much over time, and you learned a lot about this last year during the first Industrial Revolution. Farms were getting squeezed out in Europe. And so a lot of people wanted to keep farming and do what they knew how to do. And the problem was they didn't have the land or the space to do it. They could move to the United States and start farming, possibly even farming the same types of crop that they were when they were in Europe. Also, there was a lot of competition in Europe for industry jobs, the industrial jobs. But the United States, there weren't a lot of people who were already well-versed in that or were experts. And since Europe had a lot of those things first, they were able to come and pretty much right away start working in a lot of factories and doing things that the United States had a lot of, like all this big industrial boom during the Gilded Age. So lots of different reasons people came from Europe. But you see in this slide here, sorry, I'm going all over the place on you. The red line is the total immigration over time, and the blue line is the immigration by the Southern and Eastern Europeans. So you see when it really spikes. Yeah.
Are you sharing your screen?
Is it not?
No, you're not sharing your screen.
Mr. Witness!
Oh, I was doing other business. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I didn't see it at all.
I thought you had to be muted or something then. Okay, thanks for telling me. I'll show you that map. The map was the only thing I wanted you to really see, so I'm glad you brought that up. I appreciate it. So the map here, it's showing the red line and the blue line, and I'll get to it when I'm able to get out of my screen here. There we go. That's going to be better. All right. And so the blue line, as I was saying, was the Southern and Eastern Europeans. whereas the red line was the total. And you see when it spiked in like the 1890s, it started really going up until about 1920. That was when the Southern and Eastern European immigration boom was going on. So very much influenced. The whole boom of immigration was from Eastern and that wasn't fun, from Eastern and Southern Europe. Okay, the next thing here, we're going to focus on immigration from Asia. And when we're looking at immigration from Asia, we're going to start by talking about immigration from China. A great number of the immigrants were from China because the Chinese were recruited to come to the United States in order to help build the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads around the country. And that would have been during this time period, during the 1860s or 1870s was like the peak. So right around here, and you see this mini peak here of Chinese immigration. And then you're going to see another boom here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, this started causing a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment or anti-Chinese feelings, especially in the West Coast, because there was competition for, there was a lot of competition for jobs and places to live and whatnot. And once the railroads all got built up, those Chinese immigrants who came needed jobs. And they started looking in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle. And there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment because people were afraid those new Chinese immigrants that hadn't been here a long time might be looking for the same jobs as them. And there was a lot of conflict. Now, even though it started with the Chinese, and we'll look at specifics in just a little bit, the big Chinese boom of immigration, as you can see here, the first one was during this period, and then there's a second period where you see a lot of immigration in our country. Now, this is total immigration in our country, and that's a huge amount of Chinese were the immigration, okay? So the other group that gets a big immigration boom, and then there are some problems because of it, is the Japanese. Now, a lot of Japanese people end up moving to the United States because Hawaii was controlled by Japanese business people, okay? Japanese business people owned plantations in Hawaii. One of those families was the Dole family, like the bananas or the fruits. That's the pineapples and whatnot. That is the family that owned a lot of Hawaiian plantation. Well, they needed workers. And one of the cheapest workers they could find were Japanese who wanted to come work there. So they were able to get Japanese workers to come work in Hawaii. Well, eventually in 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii or brought it into the United States and made it part of the U.S. And so that made it a lot easier for those Japanese immigrants who came to Hawaii to come to the mainland U.S. Well, that started causing some issues because people were once again worried about this group of people coming and what they might do as far as jobs go and whatnot. And there were a lot of problems, okay? So you're going to see some specific laws and policies built around the Chinese and the Japanese in the West Coast especially due to immigration. Now, the thing that's part of this is something called nativism that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So the third group I want to highlight here is Latin American immigration. And Latin American immigration is a little bit different from the European and the Asian immigration in that there wasn't really a singular main port. For example, there is a main port here around San Francisco that Asian immigrants came through. There is a main port over here in New York City where European immigrants mostly came through. There were others, but those were the two main ones. When Latin American immigrants came to the United States, they would typically come through Mexico, but it wasn't all from Mexico. We're talking about anywhere in Central America, South America, the West Indies, Caribbean area. But they would come through these states typically, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, because that's the part that was connected to the mainland of Mexico where a lot of the immigrants came through or came from. Well, there was one group that came in from the West Indies. So we're talking about the Caribbean. And the West Indies, or Caribbean, you can say it either way. The West Indies were named that because Columbus, if you remember from history, was looking for India and a passage to India that was faster. And so he thought he had gotten to India and the mainland of Asia. And it turned out that it was the new land that they had discovered. And it stuck with the name the West Indies. Well, actually, today it's just a coincidence. This is Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day. A lot of you might not be familiar with like the East Coast, especially. They still, in a lot of cities, really celebrate Columbus Day. But a lot of the country, other groups celebrate Indigenous People Day and whatnot. And so it's often like a holiday on your phone. Some places get the day off. We never got that day off in Chicago growing up, but we did get a different day off that I'll explain for a while that was named after a different immigrant. Well,
my favorite immigrant.
Yeah. You'll get a good story, like some good anecdotes from Mr. Witness about this, because we truly did grow up and it was an area that had a lot of concentrated immigration, kind of like some of these areas we're going to talk about here. So that a lot of the Latino or Latin American immigrants came through Mexico here, and it was to work in fields and farms and whatnot in these areas in the Southwest. Well, a lot of the farmers needed them to work there, and in fact, the United States government often encouraged immigration to come in through there to help with the farming, with the harvest, and that was oftentimes migrant workers who would come in and work things here, and then they move up and work here and move up. And I even, an area where my family has a little cottage up in Wisconsin, like there's still summer migrant workers who come up and pick cherries and whatnot. So like migrant workers would come and just keep going where the different harvests were. And that was needed by a lot of different farmers, and it was encouraged by a lot of different farmers, but not everyone, and sometimes there would be conflict involved with that as well. But just so you're aware of some of the numbers, part of this big boom of immigrants who were Latin American came from in 1902. The United States government created the National Reclamation Act, which created new farmland in the Southwest United States. And they needed those workers. And so part of that act was to get the workers, and they brought in farm workers from Mexico. In fact, the United States brought in, and on their own, a lot of Mexican farm workers came, around 700,000 over a 20-year period from around 1910 to 1930. So there was a huge immigration from, and I'm not talking about just all of Latin America, but specifically from Mexico. And part of that was, this was during times of political strife in Mexico. So a lot of people were fleeing political tyranny or fleeing for their political beliefs. And then a lot of them ended up doing farm work in the southwestern part of the United States. So we're seeing immigration coming in the late 1800s and early 1900s from all over the world. This is a really interesting map, I think. Go ahead and take a second. It starts with 1850, and I'm going to let it play through. And it's by state, and it tells you which country most immigrants came from in that state at that time. So, like, for example, you're going to get to like 1850 here, and in Illinois, it was Germany, and it was still 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 Germany, still Germany. That's a boring. Whoa! All of a sudden, Poland in 1940, and in 1960, and in 1970, and that's going to be key. In that, Mr. Witness and I grew up in the Chicago area, and there were a lot of Polish immigrants. And Mr. Witness had talked about, like, there was always a lot of inappropriate Polish jokes growing up, and when we were growing up there, and we didn't know as little kids why and stuff. And it's part of it we're gonna see here, and this happens in different parts of the country. The newest immigrant groups were oftentimes the ones used as scapegoats for problems, or for people losing their jobs, or for different issues going on in the area. And the newest immigrant groups would get blamed for that, and then oftentimes that turned into jokes, which are often not nice and often not appropriate. And we know nowadays that inappropriate jokes can hurt and whatnot. And you don't see as many of those anymore based on especially ethnicities or based on country of origin as you used to. Now, it still happens, okay? Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, thankfully, a lot of that has been cut back over time. But it's still something you should keep an eye out for and not take part in. Now, you see in like the West Coast, it was China, then Germany, Italy, Mexico. So things changed over time. And you're going to also see like Scandinavian countries tended to be the ones that settled in the northern plain states like Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, those kind of things. You're going to see Germany in the Midwest, like Wisconsin's big with Germany. Like I already talked about, Poland is big in Illinois. And you're going to see on the East Coast a lot of Ireland for a while, and then Germany, and then different Eastern European countries. So I just think this is a really interesting map that shows a lot of that stuff and kind of gives you an idea and really shows you, hey, things go in cycles and things change. Like who might be the biggest immigrant group at this time isn't necessarily going to be the biggest immigrant group in 10 years or 20 years and whatnot. Okay. Did you have anything you added some good anecdotes the other class, Mr. Winnes? Was there anything just on that map or in general that you could help add? Because I thought you added a lot of good color commentary.
So one of the things you guys might notice is up north is Norway. And so up in like North Dakota and South Dakota and in Minnesota, here we go. Here it's coming. We see Norway, Sweden. Mm-hmm. There they are. So that chunk that's kind of around like the early part of the 1900s or so. And who's the football team up there? So if you go up into Minnesota, also if you the accent, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, there's this kind of like this known accent from the region that kind of makes people smile a little bit. If you've ever seen the movie Fargo, it's dark comedy, and some guy gets killed, and he's in a wood chipper because he was murdered there, and it's like, oh, is that your friend in the wood chipper? So they used North Dakota for that because it was kind of like the accent was partly made the dark humor a little weirder. But I come from, or one of my ancestors comes from Norway, and settled in North Dakota, in Findlay, North Dakota. My kid's name is Findlay. So there was a bunch of Norwegians up there. And so now we see that the Vikings are the team of Minnesota. So the whole region cheers for the Vikings. And why do they get called the Vikings? Well, that's because they're all Scandinavian. Not all, but there's a huge part of that population still identifies with their Scandinavian roots. So when we get to Ellis Island, I can tell about my great grandfather Alfson coming over. But that's where he went to. And it was at that same time. It was in like 1902 or something like that he came over.
Thanks for sharing that. And that's something Mr. Winnes is a really big into wordsmith. Like he's really into learning about word origin and whatnot. So I often have good conversations with him about where different words come from and whatnot. And it's, for example, he talked about the Norse. Well, that's the North, and they're talking about Northern Europe. Well, guess what? North Glen, what's their mascot? The Norse, right? Which were like the Viking people. So if you ever wonder where that came from, it's because of the name Norse and North, and they use that. Even though Colorado wasn't one of the big areas for Scandinavian immigration, it fit obviously with the North Glen city name. So a lot of these countries were just in, and also the area I was talking about with those jokes and whatnot, and being the newest immigrant group, you see starting in the 1940s and then in the 1960s, which would have been the exact time that like Mr. Winnes's parents and my parents were growing up maybe in the area, and they would have heard jokes. Then that's why they got passed down, and we didn't even know why. And it's because the Polish immigrants were the newest immigrants during the time like when our parents were growing up, and even right before we were growing up during the late 1970s. So I'm going to skip. I think that map's pretty cool, but I will save that slideshow and it'll be available in Schoology so you can take a look at any time. So this is something I want you to write down now. I told you I'd tell you, and hey, you need to write this down. Well, this is one of them, and it's Ellis Island. Ellis Island is in New York City in New York. I've been there before. It's a pretty cool place. It's a museum now. It's a national park, actually, or don't know if they designate a park or a national whatever monument or whatever, but it's part of the national park system or park service. And you can go there and learn a lot about immigration, and they even have areas where you can find out more about your immigrant past, especially if it comes from Europe. But Ellis Island was the main processing center for immigration in our country for a long time. It was the main one, especially for the East Coast. Okay, so Ellis Island, main processing center. You need to know that. Just so you know, numbers-wise, from 1892 to 1924. So we're talking about 32 to 34 years, depending on when it started or ended. Around 17 million immigrants came through Ellis Island to come to our country. Now, this was an island. This is a very small island, and that's not an accident. It's a very small island because a few things. One, they used it as a processing center because there were three things they were really looking out for. One was they were looking out for maybe people who had a criminal past and they didn't want them to come in. Or also they need to look out for and have good records of people coming into the country. And then finally, it was used as a place to basically quarantine people. A lot of people came over as immigrants with illnesses, and it was very common because this was a 7-day, about 6 to 8 day, depending, so around a week-long trip on boats from Europe. And most of these people were living in the steerage class, or down in where everybody's just on top of each other, and it was very unhealthy. There weren't windows. Why? Because the steerage class was underneath the water, and so there wasn't good ventilation, wasn't good lighting, very bad sanitation, and so a lot of people showed up at Ellis Island diseased. And some of those diseases were bad enough they wanted the people to go back, but the ones that weren't, that they would let them, or they would quarantine them until they were healthy, and then they would either decide to send them back or to let them enter the country. But that was something that, one of the reasons they did that was to make sure that sick people weren't coming in, because then they might bring it into New York City there, and then you'd have millions of people who could die from an illness that they weren't used to and their bodies hadn't built up immunity to or anything. And so this was something that was really important as a step for immigration. Now, some of you might have been like, wait, I thought the Statue of Liberty that's actually Liberty Island where the Statue of Liberty is. It's really close. It's an island in the same area here of the Sound there by Ellis Island, but it's a separate stop where the Statue of Liberty is. But yeah, I'm going to let Mr. Winnes in a second tell a little example story from his family. But for example, like my family, I'm pretty sure my great grandpa came in through Ellis Island, my dad's dad. All I know though is that he was English and that he entered when he was 14 years old, and he was by himself because he ran away from home from Europe because he was beaten all the time, and I guess he wanted to escape his mean father who would always beat him, and so he ran off. And I can't imagine entering a new country after a week-long trip on your own with nothing. But so I don't have much information about that side of the family because my great-grandpa, I guess, never talked about it much to my grandpa. He never talked about it much to my dad, who was his grandson, and he wasn't alive very long when my dad was alive. So he was gone before I was born. But so that side of the family, I don't have much information. But my last name, Hargraves, comes from him. It was English. I'm mostly German, and I'm also and then I'm Norwegian, and then Swedish and English. But my last name comes from that, but I don't know much other than that. And that was common for people. A lot of times people would come in, and they would speak different languages. My great-grandfather at least spoke English, so he could communicate. A lot of people, they couldn't communicate with, depending on how rare their language was, because of language issues. So there was a lot of name changes going on and whatnot. And I'm going to let Mr. Winnes tell you a little story about that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys can see my screen now, if my face is popping up as I'm talking or not, but I'm putting up a photo here. It's a little reflective, so sorry about that. But this is my great grandfather is named Alfson, and he owned this general store, which if you see me, you can. If you're seeing my window, you can see it in Findlay, North Dakota. And so my son, I actually named Findlay after the town that my family first moved to. Well, that part of my family. Others went back to different times. But Alf in Norway, like if you wonder all the sons, Alfson, Svensson, Stevenson, all those different names, they all come because last names aren't passed down or weren't passed down generationally. They were passed down from your father. Let me go back to I'll just go to this one for now. So they're passed down from your father. So if like my son, if I was in old Norway, I don't think they do it anymore, would have been named Stevenson because it would be based on my name. So he came into Ellis Island on his boat, and believe it or not, he was one of many Alfsons within that group, even if I've never met an Alfson in my life, but he got in, and Alf was apparently a common name in his generation. So he got in on the boat, and they said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Oh, my name's Alf Alfson." And they said, "Oh, well, there's too many Alfsons. So what city are you from?" Because that's how they would come up with names sometimes, like, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm not from the city. I'm from the Vindness." And the Vindness means windy point, which juts out into the ocean. So he's from the Vindness. So they're like, "Well, that's your name." So that's how the name Windness came to be, even though it's not like the Norwegians wouldn't recognize it as a name at all. To them, it's a place. But in the U.S., it's different. So some of you might have a background name like that you might consider where it came from. Some, like I know, for example, American slaves, when they were freed, often they didn't have last names. So they had to come up like, well, what's your last name going to be? You needed one in, the United States. So a lot of them would come up with, take it from the farm they were at, or the plantation they were at, or the town they were by. Others would, like if you Freeman became a name, like Morgan Freeman. That name is relevant to being freed, so that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different types of names, and we'll see that there's other time periods where like German names got respelled because they didn't want to look German during the World Wars and stuff like that. So there's a lot of interesting kind of name stuff.
Thanks for saying that. That actually reminded me. I tried to look up my last name origin. Hargraves. Har means hill, I guess, and graves. And so it was probably either my family came from, they lived on a hill near a graveyard, or they potentially maybe people had been gravekeepers or whatnot, in the area. But so it has something to do with that. So it's interesting. Yeah, you can find out a lot about that if you do any kind of research or just even word origin stuff. That's how I got to that point without knowing anything specific about my family. But thanks for sharing that, Mr. Witness.
Sure.
So then in San Francisco, there was another main one. This is the other thing I want you to write down, star, underline, highlight, whatnot. It's called Angel Island. Now, Angel Island was the main processing center for immigration on the West Coast. And it was located in San Francisco, and it's a place you can visit as well. This was a picture of Ellis Island. This is a picture here of Angel Island. And around 50,000 Chinese immigrants entered Angel Island during the early 1900s, around 1910 to 1940. And here's the thing. Even though it was mostly Chinese immigration, we're going to learn, was very restricted at that time. So even though there were 50,000 Chinese that entered, it would have been many, many, many more had not some restriction been put into place, which we will talk about in just a little bit. So these immigrant communities, I want to talk about kind of how people ended up where they did. A lot of the times people were looking for support systems. For example, you speak a different language. Not only that, a different alphabet you're using. You're using a different writing system of characters and whatnot. And you see like a lot of some of the dress, some of the hairstyles and whatnot were a little bit more of Chinese origin than some of the other people. This was actually a picture from Chinatown in San Francisco. And there's a reason there's places like Chinatown, or in Chicago, there's a Chinatown, but there's also a big Greek town in Chicago. And there's some other Little Italy in New York or in Chicago, where places where immigrants from the same countries kind of ended up stopping at. And part of it was a support system. They felt like they could identify with the others and fit in. And it helped them with their language barriers. They could communicate with people and not feel that they were left out and misunderstood all of the time. And so that is a form of segregation that was going on over a long time, but it was basically chosen segregation. It's what they would call de facto segregation that we learned about in the first unit of the year. And that de facto segregation, or by fact, not de jure segregation, which is by law, that still happens today. You still have certain parts of cities or towns where the newest immigrants tend to come into. It happens in Denver. It happens still in Chicago. It happens in New York still. For the longest time in New York, and we're going to study more about this area, the Lower East Side of Manhattan has long had the newest immigrant groups always coming into there. So the different countries of origin and ethnicities have changed over time, but typically the newest immigrants have settled in certain areas. Nativism. This is a big thing, vocab word you're going to need to know. Yes, Mr. Windus.
We should watch Gangs of New York.
Oh. I think it's rated R, but yeah, it's a good one.
This is a great movie about these battling immigrant groups that are trying to secure their kind of place within the New York City, which was almost entirely immigrants for a lot of its history.
Right.
Like over 50% easily.
So this term nativism, I want to tell you right now, a few of you aren't going to ever pick it up because you're not going to be paying close attention. Don't be that person. Nativism is a term that is referring to overt favoritism towards native-born Americans, or basically it's favoring native-born Americans over immigrants. And oftentimes it gets into discrimination then, and worse. And that's why, so if you ever hear the term nativism, it's often said as kind of a negative thing because it usually means certain groups are being excluded or picked on or viewed differently than other groups. Well, here's what it was. It would be where people who were kind of the main people in charge of a town, maybe they were in government, the business leaders or whatnot, they would prefer the groups that had established there versus new immigrant groups. And part of it was because they didn't want to lose their power. It was like when we learned about the plantation owners in the South during Reconstruction. They didn't want to lose their voting power and all their lose all their power due to the money that they had made through plantations and whatnot. Well, nativism is this viewpoint usually because people don't want to give up power, but it's actually very hypocritical and actually ironic in a way because, first of all, we're not talking about Native Americans when they're talking about native born. They just mean people who are born in the United States. But most of these people who have nativist views, and it still happens today, are people whose families didn't originally come from the area. Like at some point, unless you're a Native American and you can trace your family's roots back to the United States, or America, I should say, your family was a family of immigrants. And so having this nativist viewpoint is pretty hypocritical in that at some point your family is in the same boat, okay? Now, that often happens though, like I said, due to fear of losing maybe jobs, not understanding different religions, different skin colors, not understanding languages, cultural fears, discrimination due to different kinds of food people eat and hygiene issues. So there's so many different things, but this is something that was big in the turn of the century, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this gave rise to a lot of anti-immigrant groups, okay? For example, this was a sign you might see in New York or Chicago. It said, help wanted, no Irish need apply, okay? Even though they wanted help only from certain people. Or here's an example. This was in San Francisco. Chinese? No. Come to 10th and A Streets at 7:30 Monday evening and express your opinion on the Chinese question. Shall we have Chinese? No. Well, here's the deal. It's already answering the question. And it says, come express your opinion. Guess who is welcome at this meeting to express your opinion on the question. The people who thought no, Chinese should not be allowed, not people who thought maybe the Chinese should be allowed. Those people would have probably gotten beat up or worse if they had shown up to this meeting. So this is the kind of thing that resulted from nativism, was a lot of discriminatory practices towards different ethnic groups or different immigrant groups from different countries of origin. Now, if you were from the right country for different things, you were the ones they wanted to apply for the job. But typically what they would call the wrong countries were the newest immigrants. So we're not talking about the Northern European immigrants or the Western European immigrants. Like, we're not talking about German, English, French, Spanish, Norwegian, Swedish, those groups. We're talking about the ones that they considered wrong countries a lot during this Gilded Age would have been Italians, Russians, Polish, Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, Nicaraguan, things like that. Places from Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe. And
also non-Protestant.
Exactly. And so those groups are often, they were more Catholic-based countries versus Protestant-based countries. And that's where I want to show you guys, it's at the bottom there, it's this term called WASP, W-A-S-P. Oops, I went ahead a little bit. WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It's an acronym used to describe people who are white of Anglo origin. So of, what is
English.
that, Mr. Wynn, is European west of the Ural Mountains or whatever, I think, or something like that.
You know, I mean, the Anglos were kind of northwestern Europe and then moved into England.
And then Protestants, people of the Protestant religion. You guys learned about Protestants last year. That started with Martin Luther breaking away from the Catholic Church and starting Lutheranism, and then the different Protestant churches that happened after that were the Christian churches that were not Catholic. And those were the ones that were considered by most people to be the okay immigrants. If you were Catholic or Jewish, it wasn't just the countries. If you were Catholic or Jewish from, for example, Germany, or if you were from Ireland or from England or any of those places and weren't Protestant, you were often discriminated against as well. Now, in our country, we have a long history of people matching the WASP designation, having the power in government and whatnot. In fact, it wasn't until John F. Kennedy in the 1960s when our first president was not WASP, or White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, wasn't identified as that. Why? Because John F. Kennedy was a Catholic. Okay,
he was Irish descent too, Catholic Irish.
And the other thing is, you were not, another person who was not in the WASP group that based on color would have been, for example, President Obama was the first non-white president, as you're probably aware, of the United States. And so there has been a long history out of 45 presidents, basically 43 you would talk about, would identify or have been identified by other people as fitting that category of background, basically. And so it just shows you it wasn't just during this Gilded Age that a lot of these kind of feelings or reactions were going on.
Hey, Mr. Hargraves.
So I want to, do we want to go ahead and take a little break here, everybody? And
yeah, we're at that spot.
Let's go ahead and we'll get started at 2:38. So it's 2:33, so take 5 minutes, and you can go ahead and take a break until then. 2:38.
Hold on. Can I get Delaney and Brianna, if you guys could just check in with us real quick here about some grading, just making sure that we can get your grades in the right way and stuff. Otherwise, guys, take 5. We'll see you later.
Okay. So the last couple slides here we're going to look at. This next one, it's just interesting to me. It came out in recent years, but it was a graph that was showing how long or how popular it was to change the name, or for naming new immigrant babies, to have names like that were of origin or that sounded more ethnic based on where the people came from. So like a name that was very maybe Italian or German or Norwegian or whatnot, like if they thought it was like, for example, like the name Lars, that would be more Swedish or Norwegian, and that would have been more popular to name somebody like that early on when the family moved to the country than later. So it became a lot less common for families to name their children names that would have been common in their home countries once they'd been here a while. So it just kind of shows you that idea of assimilation or people kind of blending more into the culture. And that was something, remember, during the first unit, we learned about the United States government trying to assimilate Native Americans into Western culture, what they called Americanize them, which once again was pretty ironic. And that idea of blending in was tried to be done with things like the Dawes Act to get people to get the 160 acres to farm and whatnot. So the last slide here I want to go over, there's a lot here, and I'll explain some different things. And there's two things I really want you to write down that I'll tell you in just a second. But this is just kind of a history of different laws that were passed in our country during the Gilded Age, especially, that were anti-immigrant, okay, or that were specifically targeting immigrants. And one was a literacy test bill was passed by Congress in 1897 that required immigrants to be able to read at least 40 words in English or their native language. And this was a way to try to cut down on the number of immigrants coming in who weren't educated. Congress passed this, but it was vetoed by President Grover Cleveland, and it didn't become a law then. But it just shows you kind of the attitudes towards new immigrants that, hey, we want people who are well educated, not necessarily people who don't have the best education coming in. Another thing that was passed was in 1917, and it was similar to that. It was known as the Literacy Act, and Congress passed it, and then President Wilson actually vetoed it. But this was the year that the United States entered World War I, but Congress actually overrode the veto, and it became law. Part of the reason it happened in 1917 was because that would have been when the United States did join World War I, and there was a lot of anti-German sentiment at the time, and some different groups were definitely seen as being our enemy. And so a lot of people were trying to target people whose origins were maybe from those countries. And that's something this Literacy Act was kind of trying to do as well. Now, this is one of the ones I definitely want you guys to write down and underline, highlight, whatever. The Chinese Exclusion Act, okay? This was big because it wasn't just a literacy test where it could be applied to different groups. This was a law that specifically targeted people from one country, okay? And in 1882, Congress passed this Chinese Exclusion Act. And part of the reason was, as we talked about, a lot of Chinese immigrants were needed to build the railroads in our country because they had skills with traversing a lot of things in the mountains and with working with gunpowder and different explosives and being able to fit in some different areas based on some training and whatnot. And once the railroads were largely built and whatnot, a lot of those jobs went away. And so a lot of those Chinese immigrants started looking for jobs maybe in cities like San Francisco. And that caused a lot of problems because people with more nativist viewpoints started clashing with them. And this law was then passed in 1882, and it banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. Now, not all Chinese immigration. There were some exceptions. Like I said, from 1910 to 1940, I believe it was like 30,000 or 50,000 Chinese immigrated, but that was because this was cut down a lot. Some of the exceptions were students. They wanted people to come in from China to come to our universities so they could spread Western culture and ideas of capitalism and whatnot to China, and also then pay tuition and whatnot to help our economy. So students were an exception. So were teachers. They wanted teachers who could communicate with both Chinese and with people who spoke English and other Americans, and wanted those people to be able to teach at universities and whatnot. So they were an exception. Merchants who sold specific goods and had skills, like maybe people who worked with specifically with something like silk or with good Chinese porcelain china work and whatnot, like things that were special. Those people were allowed to come in. Tourists, they were allowed to come in because they wanted the tourism money to keep coming in. The west coast of our country had a lot of Chinese tourism, and also Hawaii would as well. And then finally, government officials. So if you were a diplomat or an ambassador or whatnot from China, you could come to the United States. But otherwise, you were not allowed to come. You were banned from immigrating to the United States for 10 years starting in 1882. However, in 1892, that law was extended for another 10 years. And then in 1902 is extended indefinitely, meaning from 1882, and it ended up finally being repealed or stricken from the records in 1943. So basically for over 60 years, Chinese immigration was banned to the United States. And so this was unique because this was a specific ethnic / country of origin group that were being treated differently from all other groups of immigrants in our country. And so Chinese immigration was largely throttled or held back during this time period. 1943 is when it was repealed, and I have zero doubt that it had something to do with World War II, because that was in the middle of us being in World War II, and China was a partial ally of ours in helping us with defeating Japan. And so I imagine it was something that was worked out during that time to end that.
There probably weren't a lot of boats going back and forth at that time, though, either.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of a dangerous. You didn't want to be in the Pacific Rim taking a boat, either a tourism boat or a boat shipping immigrants. Yeah, that would have been very dangerous as well. So yeah, that ended in 1943. So it just showed you for over 60 years, this was seen as normal or okay or the right thing to do in our country. And nowadays we would see that as maybe that would get a lot more, I would say, people reacting to it in different ways if it was going on today. But we still see different reactions to different groups based on things going on, like countries that might have a lot of political strife or a lot of issues with hunger and whatnot, and refugee groups. And so this is they've had these kind of things going on for a long time, and you still see some of them. Now, another group, so Chinese Exclusion Act, you need to know it big time. Another group that was coming in and then was discriminated against were the Japanese. Japanese immigrant segregation ended up happening in 1906 in San Francisco. Basically, they took all the Japanese public school students and said, you have to go in your own school. Now, obviously, that kind of stuff was going on, we know, in a lot of schools around the country with African Americans and other minority groups being separated because, remember, Plessy versus Ferguson made that legal. So this wasn't illegal necessarily in our country, but this was new in that area, and it was new being that it was a immigrant group that we're talking about being segregated. Now, this really angered Japan because Japan wanted to have cultural relations with the United States, not necessarily equal ones, but wanted to be able to have their people come and live and learn in the United States. And this really made Japan angry, and they ended up striking a deal with President Teddy Roosevelt in that Teddy Roosevelt said, fine, here's the deal. We will get rid of the segregated schools of Japanese immigrants in San Francisco as long as you start limiting immigration of unskilled workers from Japan. Basically saying kind of what the Chinese Exclusion Act did, but for Japanese people. So Teddy Roosevelt made a deal with the Japanese leadership that said, if you stop letting Japanese people come to the United States who don't have special skills, then we won't segregate the schools. So it just shows you there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment going on, or anti-Asian feelings going on in our country at the time, especially on the West Coast. Okay. Now this deal.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm putting into chat, guys, a word that is a really important one to know. And you should jot it into your notes, and it's the word xenophobia. Because we've heard it in the news a lot in the last probably like decade or so. We had the refugees from Syria, and we had people coming up from Central America. And so the word xenophobia has been kicked around a lot, and it's a good one to know. And it basically, xeno, this is from Greek. Phobia is a fear of something, right? Usually an irrational fear. But xeno is specific to outsiders or visitors is what it means in Greek. And so it's a fear of outsiders, or kind of like a prejudice against people from other countries or of other ethnicities or other groups that are outside your own. And so it's just a good word to know. Another word that kind of goes along with it, if you want to take more of a psychological view, is tribalism. And one of the things we hear a lot in today's discussion is tribalism, and how people might be kind of identifying with the group almost in the way that like our early ancestors may have identified with the tribe. And so you do everything you can to protect your tribe. And so there's this fear of other tribes. And so tribalism and xenophobia are often, they go together. I don't want to say they go together well, like because they work out great. I mean, they go together well in that they mean similar things. So just a couple of ideas to kind of just have in your head, a couple of words that you should have jotted down because you'll see them pop up again.
Thanks. Yeah, so then basically that agreement was known as the Gentleman's Agreement. And that was the other thing I really wanted to write down and highlight is, so the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Agreement were two specific examples that you're probably going to want to use in an assessment at the end of the unit, hint, hint, and be able to explain them and how different immigrant groups were discriminated against or maybe treated differently. And so then that vocab word that's related to some of those things Mr. Winnes was talking about that often led to those things was that term nativism, because nativism could then either it was fueled by some of those xenophobic views, but also it led to more xenophobic views. It kind of started that cycle basically. So those are the things you absolutely need to know and that you should be make sure that you understand for our purposes as far as the unit in immigration during the Gilded Age and whatnot.